Welcome to the Arts Lunch at United Theo. I'm the only one in here, so I'm going to do this. Welcome to the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I'm Jennifer Oz Freeman. I'm the Assistant Professor and Program Director of Theology and the Arts here at United, and we're very excited to have a friend of United, Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus, and also Professor of Religion at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, speaking to us today about food and religion, everyone's favorite topic, and a good, very fitting topic for the Arts Lunch, of course. So
cool. So I'm going to share screen because I have like a PowerPointy thing, but just interrupt me anytime you want to, except you, Max. Here we go. Let me just do this. Okay, so I blatantly stole Max's characterization of things as Theopoetics because why not? But also, I love that you've asked me to do that. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this, but I love the context of being able to do this in an arts lunch because it makes me focus on how I actually look at my my ritual practice as art, as a kind of theopoetics, and so that's kind of where I'm going now. I'm also being very seasonal here because I'm thinking a lot about Thanksgiving food rituals, although as you'll see, what I want to do with them is informed very much by the way that I do Jewish food rituals. And so I'm going to talk about the myth-making power of meals as midrash, but in a sense, what I understand midrash as a theopoetic practice, and not only applied to texts and applying textual traditions to address contemporary concerns, but also to food itself. And so I'm kind of giving you an example of what basically of what I'm doing with connecting food and religious and with food and religion. So let me just go right into it. I'm working on a project right now on a book, but basically a book project on kind of redoing Thanksgiving food rituals and practices. I started doing some essays on this, and I'm actually currently doing a little bit with this on a project that I'm collaborating with another member of our family, with my daughter Zoya, on kind of the ways that immigrants adapt to American culture through their food choices and food fusions. But I started out with just writing a paper, and then everybody I've talked to says, "Oh, this sounds like a book project." And so I take people's advice, and so it's going to be a book project. So let's go. So when you think of Thanksgiving, this is probably what you may think of. This is the iconic picture of American Thanksgiving. You can see what is distinctively, I mean, it's super white, it's super New England, it's Norman Rockwell. I mean, and it is probably a vision of Thanksgiving, of what people might have in their mind as a traditional Thanksgiving. And so if one is doing midrash of anything, you're always doing it on an inherited tradition. So let's assume that that this is kind of the text and practice that I am doing midrash on. How about that? Okay, so let's move on. I'm gonna actually have to make my picture a little, here, make this a little smaller. So again, like I said, this is part of a larger project, a book project, but I also do this in practice too. Every Thanksgiving, I'm trying to remake Thanksgiving in my family ritual practice too, sometimes due to no choices of my own, like COVID. But in order to remake Thanksgiving meal rituals, I kind of looked at some of the things that are characteristic or important aspects that make Thanksgiving meal rituals. One is the food preparation itself and the kind of talk that often goes along with that, the kitchen talk, which I kind of alluded to, is that, before we even started, that a lot of the way that my family prepares for holidays is we talk to our we talk to Max, we talk to Zoya, we talk to other people about what are you making, and sharing recipes and things like that. And so there's this, that's the preparation is as much a part of the kind of ritual of making it as the actual performance of the Thanksgiving meal. Definitely following from my own Jewish tradition that kind of uses the Passover Seder as a model. There is table talk. That is a certain way that we ritualize the Thanksgiving meal practice. And I am thinking, to some of the things that I'm pulling from in order to make it not so Norman Rockwell-y, the kind of Thanksgiving practice or ritual practice that I envision. I will be drawing from stories and practices from my Jewish family traditions, from other people's African American, Native American, yes, New England regional, because that is kind of part of the Thanksgiving mythic language and symbolism, and also the sustainable food movements family and communal tradition. So these are all things that I'm drawing from, or to put it in more concrete form. Wait, okay, I have to move on. Okay, how do I do this? Why am I not moving on to mine? Here we go. These are the books. I'm a very book person. In the Norman Rockwell picture, envisioning a certain model of Thanksgiving and the story behind that, I asked, like, what's missing from the story? And these are pretty much the books that I've been reading that, among others, that are shaping what's missing from the story. So there's Michael Twitty's The Cooking Gene, where he's looking at kind of African-American heritage of American cooking, Braiding Sweetgrass, that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Religion in the Kitchen is a book that I've started to use by Elizabeth Perez, that's in a class that I teach on called Smells and Bells, the Sensual Dimensions of Religion. And I look at the different senses and how they are exploited by different religious traditions to achieve certain kinds of experiences. And she's the book that I'm using now for taste. And this book is about the practice of a small Chicago house temple for, I think it's called Lukumi. It's a kind of Santeria practice, but it's all basically cooking food for the deities. That's pretty much a lot of the practice. And so it's a fascinating book. And so a lot of the ideas that I pulled out for this are coming from that. I've also been reading extensively about Jewish veganism and vegetarianism. And I'm also very, very interested in the whole, how can we not be, in how our eating practices affect and can maybe affect for the better climate change. So Jonathan Safran Foer's book, We Are the Weather. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. Okay. So in kind of retelling the Thanksgiving story, I want, it's particularly in picking out, foods, I want to have a diversity of foods and a diversity of stories in this kind of midrashic remaking of Thanksgiving, obviously to reflect the diversity of people and cultures of America. Also to respect the biodiversity of other than human persons with whom we share the land. I mean, that Thanksgiving is also about our relationship to the plants and animals that we are sharing land with and eating. And to acknowledge those who aren't there in person in our choice of representative foods and the words we speak formally and informally at the table. So again, it's like, these are the things that I don't see in the Norman Rockwell picture that I want to put in the picture through developing new stories and new rituals and basically new foods. So to move from looking at midrash of text to midrash of food, it's all about saying things with food. We say things with food themselves and the words that we say about them, and that's what I would call culinary midrash. Now, since I haven't defined it yet, midrash is the Jewish term in Hebrew for the process of continuous interpretation and application of inherited texts and traditions to address new historical and cultural circumstances. And a kind of classic example of applying a kind of culinary midrash comes from kind of one of one of my favorite holidays in the Jewish calendars, Passover Seder, and we have a text, the Passover Haggadah, but it takes us through eating various symbolic foods that have meaning in symbolizing different aspects of Jewish history, of Jewish experience, of the agricultural calendar, all these different kinds of things. And a kind of classic example of that is something that we eat for the Passover Seder. That's an effort to interpret our experience, is the Hillel Sandwich, which is a sandwich made out of matzah with bitter herb, or maror, or horseradish, and charoset, which is usually it's a sweet kind of fruity paste that's delightful. And you make a sandwich out of this, but the idea is that you're mixing bitter and sweet, and much of the text and subtext of the Passover Haggadah, of the ritual, is that that's what Jewish experience is, a history of slavery and freedom, of oppression and freedom from oppression. And that's a particular aspect of a Jewish experience, but it also is arguably, I don't think anyone's gonna argue with me, is that it's an aspect of our human experience, that to be human is to have to eat the bitter and sweet together. And so we kind of enact that in a Hillel sandwich. So I'm kind of like doing sort of midrash on the foot, right as I'm talking. And then the last image that I have on this page is a kind of adaptation of the Passover Seder meal practice that's occurred over time. Not a Passover Seder, but a Tu B'Shvat Seder, a kind of ritual of eating symbolic fruits and foods to celebrate the new year for the trees. And so again, this is a continuous interpretation of texts and traditions and applying them to somewhat different circumstances. If you can see in the middle of that, I have some of the symbolic foods there of different fruits, but also we have a grape-shaped challah and a sheaf of wheat-shaped challah, because I like to vary what kind of breads I'm eating for Jewish holiday. Another kind of example of culinary midrash. So meals are culinary midrash. Well, I guess what I like about it is that beyond just reading texts, food has an affective aspect to it that kind of sticks with you. And so you're not just reinterpreting something intellectually and cognitively, but you're also internalizing it affectively and to have a kind of powerful sensory experience. So I'm taking as example some kinds of food variations. Like, it's very typical for Jewish holidays to serve some kind of bread. So particularly on the Sabbath, you have a challah that's kind of a rich bread that a lot of eggs in it and a little sweet. But then for other holidays, what I do and has occurred in Jewish tradition is to kind of adapt the challah to the themes of the holidays. So for the holiday celebrating the reception of the Torah, Shavuot or Pentecost, that happens 50 days after Passover, since it celebrates the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, we make these 7 heaven breads that are sort of in the shape of Mount Sinai, and they have different symbolic items about, we have like the giant fish, Leviathan, that we're supposed to eat according to Jewish tradition at the end of time. There's also a giant bird that is going to be part of the Messianic banquet. There's a ladder, which you can't really tell because not everything cooks very well on things don't always hold their shape in the oven. Of like Jacob's ladder climbing up to the heavens and so on. So it's a tasty food, but it is also something that bears on it actual symbols of values in our tradition. And then to the right of that, I have a challah that I often make during the harvest holiday of Sukkot. That's a little bit different. It's not an egg bread. I use a lot of the herbs from our garden that are still usually around, going strong. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, also, an allusion to the songs that we grew up with. It's a recipe from King Arthur's flour company, Harvest Wheat Bread. It's got a mixture of, it's whole wheat, it's got bulgur in it. And we often have vegan friends over to celebrate for Sukkot. And so it is a challah that doesn't have any eggs in it and doesn't have any, and so that's another kind of adaptation that we make. So it kind of has some of the harvesty items in it. It's kind of got the right colors. It's drawing from our own herb harvest. And so I make this kind of bread, but it's also in the shape of what looks like a challah. Now, sometimes I will do a midrash on the midrash. And in fact, in our family, we often talk about whether even, we talk about when we're making recipes, Maia and I, my wife and I, we talk about drashing them, which is kind of the verb form of midrash, that we're going to adapt them. We're going to do something different with them. So on the left side is something that that some colleagues and I at Wheaton entered for a contest. We lost because other people entered like something that had meat in it, but a kind of cooking contest that was around the harvest time. But we wanted to put together something that kind of reflected a harvest vegetarian main dish. So it's got the harvest wheat bread as a base and a kind of wreath. And then there's squash and there's other kind of root vegetables that are symbolizing the kind of the fall, winter, the fall foods. It was quite delicious, but students judged the contest, and they if you have cooked pork in it, I mean, that's always going to win over that. This is a more recent version of something that I do. It was a Halloween challah, another drash of the challah drash. You can see that I adapt American Halloween themes to it. It's also it's really rich pumpkin flavored dough. It's got pumpkin spice in it. It's actually really too sweet. I tried to make teeth out of candy corn, but they don't do very well in the oven. But nonetheless, it was a delightful way to celebrate Halloween. Max can tell you, because when at the Jewish day school that he went to, in certain Jewish circles, Halloween is like, oh, you can't celebrate that, that's pagan. But in our household, Halloween is the holy of holies of days, and so we accordingly adapt our Jewish ways to celebrate Halloween. Now, we also want to retell the story of Thanksgiving, and so there are diverse ways in which Americans can celebrate the civil religious meal. And we do that through the choices of foods we prepare and eat, the ways we choose or choose not to tell the iconic traditional story of the first Thanksgiving in Massachusetts, and with whom we choose to share our meals. And I think this came to, I think a striking example of this is in the newest season of Padma Lakshmi's Taste the Nation. Has anyone seen it yet?
We just started it.
Okay, so this is the second episode in which it was a Wampanoag, our local the local Native American tribe from the area where we live, that was featured there, and they were very much talking about how they're part of this, that demythologizing the story of this, the delightful nonviolent interaction of the first Thanksgiving, and kind of talking about their own stories and their own traditional memories of it. And then, of course, since it was a show about the foods, they demonstrated some of the kinds of foods that were distinctive parts of Wampanoag cooking traditions. And actually, one of the women there, I think it's the woman all the way on the right, Sherry Pocknet, has opened a Wampanoag restaurant in Charlestown, Rhode Island, and so they kind of featured some of the stuff that she's doing. So that's an area near us. But again, that what Padma Lakshmi was doing in that episode, and what the Native American participants in that episode were doing, was their own kind of culinary midrash of Thanksgiving that involved their story and included them in their story. And that you'll often see that your local celebrity, the sous chef, is always interviewed around Thanksgiving as how should we celebrate Thanksgiving in a way that acknowledges the history, and so he always has a piece. He has a few pieces as well on retelling the story, but also in stressing, remember, don't forget where the traditional Thanksgiving foods come from. So these are some of the ways that that we are the typical kinds of foods that people use for Thanksgiving, or ways that they do Thanksgiving that really stresses, instead of that kind of single menu that you sort of see in the Norman Rockwell picture. The kinds of Thanksgiving meals that I go to, and probably, or maybe many of you go to, have a diversity of foods. They are often potlucks. I mean, there's the whole phenomenon of Friendsgiving, which is another whole story, but we could talk about that a little bit too. They are very likely to have vegetarian options. The kinds of foods that are part of the often the traditional Thanksgiving menu are involve the three sisters, corn, squash, and beans. And so there's the dish in the corner, in the bottom corner over here. That is kind of a dish made of all of those different kinds of things. It's typical for us to try to put in other kinds of Native American foods in our Thanksgiving dishes, like cranberries, tree nuts, wild rice, turkey. But also, another part of our history is the New England cider, and yes, Mayflower Thanksgiving ale, which I find quite delicious. So there is still the old Plymouth aspects of Thanksgiving, but I think what's different about this is an explicit acknowledgement of where these foods are coming from. That's really important, and kind of doing a more ethically aware new Thanksgiving ritual. Now, another interesting phenomenon that you see in Thanksgivings are the ways that various ethnic variations on standard Thanksgiving dishes. So there's an interesting book that the Plymouth Plantation puts out, a cookbook, but they feature like all of these different kinds of variations on traditional, quote, traditional Thanksgiving foods. So you'll have an Indian roast turkey with yogurt marinade, or a Cuban style a turkey, or other foods besides turkey, like roast pork or Canadian pork pie. A tradition in New England is this kind of Bell's stuffing mix, and so that's kind of I guess I've never used it, but apparently a lot of people here use that, and so that's a kind of way of sort of celebrating New England heritage. Also in our area, there's a large Portuguese population, so having linguiça in the stuffing, it would be typical. Then you'll have another option is Chinese American rice dressing. Southern cornbread dressings, and even a Lebanese rice and meat, raz bilachmi stuffing. But again, you see what people are doing is that, and if anyone's ever seen the movie, have any of you seen the movie What's Cooking? I should look at you all and see. It basically looks at four different families in LA that are all celebrating Thanksgiving, each making turkey and the Thanksgiving meal in their own particularly ethnic way. That's a Vietnamese family, a Mexican family, a Jewish family, and an African American family. But you get the idea, is that that they're putting their own kind of family ethnic stamp on the dishes. Now, my favorite holiday that only comes around once every 27,000 years is when Thanksgiving and Hanukkah converge. And so this became a great opportunity to explore ways of doing midrash on the traditional Hanukkah foods that also had a kind of Thanksgiving flavor. So again, things like pumpkin flavored challahs, stuffing with turkey with, I think there was like a potato latke stuffing. And then also you see the iconic Hasidic Gothic representatives of our family, celebrating. Actually, this year, while they don't exactly converge, they come really close together. And so if you look, you'll see a lot of recipes. The ways that the media marks holidays is through different seasonal recipes. And so you'll see a lot of discussions about trying to do fusions of Thanksgiving and Hanukkah flavors this year too, because they come so close together. So yeah, Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. Just a couple of other things. I mean, these aren't really food things, but these are inherited traditions from my mother is a Jewish immigrant to New England, and so she worships the Kennedy family and Puritan Protestant rituals, and so she had us. When I was growing up, we always had to sing "We Gather Together" and "Over the River and Through the Woods," and then she printed this out and Xeroxed it for us and insisted that that her three sons have this at subsequent Thanksgiving celebrations. So this has always been a part of our, plus this little reading, there's a reading here about from John F. Kennedy's last speech shortly before he was assassinated that has become a kind of part of the Kraus or Brumberg-Kraus family ritual. There's even been efforts to do, what some Jews have done is come up with a Thanksgiving Haggadah with an actual text for that. And Max, was this yours? I can't remember.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so Max did one. But the founder of the particular Jewish movement that I'm a part of, Reconstructionist Judaism, Mordechai Kaplan, also designed a Thanksgiving Seder as well. Oh yeah, it says assembled by Max Brumberg-Kraus. I should have read that. Okay, and then people are writing new prayers, and so this is you can't really see this, but it's a really nice prayer that involves a land acknowledgement and a connection of the Native American experience to the American immigrant experience, which I think a lot of us celebrate in Thanksgiving. And then finally, the last example of kind of culinary midrash is the Zoomification of Thanksgiving. And you may recognize some of the characters here. And this is how we're able to celebrate Thanksgiving when families are living all around families and friends are living all around the country and can't come visit each other in person. So and also it's a tradition for a lot of Jewish holidays to have like a second day. So we decided to say we're going to have a second day of Thanksgiving in 2020. And so this is our second day of Thanksgiving in 2020, in which we celebrated with some members of the Union, from the United community, and also members of my other members of our family as well. So that's pretty much what I have to say. It was more just kind of sharing with you a little bit of my ritual art and practice. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat yet, but I see. Okay, so yes, okay. Max, what was this? Potential security issues selected. What's the what's the image that you have?
Oh, it's a Shavuot Challah. I don't know why it's
Okay,
not dangerous.
okay, all right. But I've been influenced a lot in some of the work that I've been doing by your local Sean Sherman, who has a lot of really wise things to say about it. And if only I could get into his restaurant, but it's like a 3-month, 4-month, year-long wait to get in it, right? Has anyone been there yet? You've been there. Lucky you, Jennifer. How was it?
Oops, sorry. I forgot that I was on the sound. Yeah, I went just a couple weeks ago. And I enjoyed it very much. It's in a beautiful location, for one. It's a lovely setup, but also it's really interesting to eat from a palate that is, it's a decolonized menu. So they're not
Yes.
using wheat flour, they're not using sugar, they're not using so many of the elements that are just like really pervasive in American dining. But like I grew up, eating wild rice and venison and kind of like more gamey things. So it's a palate that I like. I miss having cranberries that aren't sweetened. They're just really hard to find in the Twin Cities, like at grocery stores and things. So I really enjoyed it. I think that it's maybe for some people it might take getting used to because we're so used to having processed.
Right. I think also he's doing a thing that you find a lot of people who are trying to do something with their ethnic food traditions within American context, which is also to kind of upscale it a little bit. I mean, he's very ideological about it too, as being consistent about only using ingredients, but also it's fancy. I mean, it's an effort. It's kind of like, well, let's make it like high-end Native American food, and you see that, and it's interesting. I noticed that a lot because I compare it to the restaurant that I just found out about here in Rhode Island. It's called the Sly Fox Den 2. That's run by the Wampanoag cook, and it's first of all, it's much more a fusion of like kind of classic American diner food and Wampanoag food. It's not as I don't want to say pretentious, because but it isn't. And as a foodie, I like pretension because I like pretentious food sometimes. But it's just different. It's a totally different vibe. And I and that so I that's another way to kind of adapt, do midrash on your traditions and on American traditions in the variety of ways. Anyway, I know I talked a lot about and gave very concrete examples about stuff, but it was really mostly to show you. I mean, does it make sense what I'm saying? What we're doing with food is that we're always adapting food, and we're always trying to say something with it, and we're trying to be. And I think what I have to say about Thanksgiving is I love Thanksgiving. I love cooking for Thanksgiving. I love the kind of family aspect of it. I love the kind of the it's kind of an immigrant holiday of sorts too. It's a holiday. I mean, one of the points of what's cooking is that it's how immigrants or immigrant families kind of mark their feeling American. And so it's important that way. But, clearly it's super problematic in so many ways. And so I want to do a Thanksgiving and celebrate a Thanksgiving and celebrate the harvest. I mean, I also find the harvest holidays like incredibly powerful and moving. And thank God it like starts in for me, harvest holidays like start in September with Sukkot, and then go to Halloween, and then and take and end up in Thanksgiving. And so we get like 3 months of harvest holidays, and this has been an incredible fall. It just kept going, and it's been really pleasant out, and the leaves have been really nice out here, and so that's been kind of good, I guess, all thanks to climate change. So we'll be paying for it later, but it's been good right now. So so I think that there's a compelling reason, at least on my part, to want to figure out how to do this. But also I think for a lot of people, Thanksgiving is kind of the quintessential American civic religious holiday, and we can tell a better story. And the kinds of things that people like Sean Sherman are doing, and the Puck, well, I forgot their name, but the family, the Wampanoag family, and Michael Twitty with African American food is saying that is American food. This is the American food, and don't forget that that's part of the story. And so I think it's really important to like make food choices that explicitly model the community that we want to be. And there are ways to do that. You just have to learn to speak the language of food, which I'm sure all of you know how to speak. There are many different languages of food, but anyway, so I'll leave it at that. Because that was a lot of talking. And so, like, what are your thoughts or reflections, or what are things that what do you do, or how do you come to terms with, let's say, Thanksgiving, or are there other ways in which you are intentional about the way that you celebrate things with food, and what kinds of things you do with food? That's a lot.
Yeah, and this isn't surprising because I know Max, but something that struck me too in what you're describing, talking about the game and stuff too, is the importance of like playfulness with food too, and imagination. And that seems like, like there are recipes and there are traditions that are handed down in families and things like that. And sometimes there's, when you receive a family recipe, sometimes there are like strict instructions, like you shouldn't deviate from this, or if you do it a certain way, then it no longer counts as so-and-so's recipe or something like that.
Right.
But, and that's its own thing, right? But then, I love all the, some of that, like you said, like the drashing of the meals and tradition seems important. Creates new traditions or variations on them. Yeah.
But you do bring up a good point. I mean, people, you always hear this, is that people get very touchy about messing with their family Thanksgiving traditions. And so my own sense about how to do that is, don't change everything. You have to keep some of and I guess one of the reasons why I think Midrash is an effective way of adapting the old to the new is because you always keep some of the old. I mean, you have to. And it's always an explicit reference that I'm playing with the old. And so you don't eliminate the old. And so I'll have, like, I want to have all these gestures to, like, New England cuisine and things like that, that even if it is, I mean, and also, I mean, in the spirit of the Hillel Sandwich, even if it's bad, I mean, even if there are stories of violence attached to it, we don't erase those stories, and at least in the way the Jews retell our stories, we put them in there, and then we try to sweeten them, but we don't throw out the bitter part. We eat one big Hillel sandwich of them, and I think I would like to see more of that too.
I liked the part of your question from before about like how you reckon with Thanksgiving. And I'm thinking also a lot of the work that Stephanie that you've done with monuments, and writing and thoughts around how can we do something other than taking down a monument. And I feel
Right.
similarly with Thanksgiving that there's so much opportunity to tell stories of pain and also stories of survival, and also to like learn about foodways where we are geographically, learning about tradition. Like there's so many other options than canceling a holiday. And yeah, I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts are, Stephanie, thinking of your work with monuments.
Thanks, Max. No, I mean, that is kind of the essence of it, of like, there's both, I think the two sides of the consequences of just like banning something, canceling a person, getting rid of this monument that might have been problematic but present for a long time, is that you are both erasing like what potential like things this has built and led to or is attached to that are positive, and you're erasing a story that we might need to learn from. And I think like through history, this attempt to like remove something usually just doesn't work anyway, because we end up creating something instead that's similar, unless you find a creative way to keep it present, but to recover and reorient and remix, which I think is exactly the examples that you're sort of offering here, which requires work. I think that's the thing that is sometimes intimidating, or that in my own experience, sometimes my family resists. It's like, well, it's already enough work to like cook a whole meal or to get together and hold all of that, but to do the work of creatively reinventing, of learning that history, of changing the tradition, that requires some creativity and it requires people to show up. And there's a lot of like maybe emotional labor involved in that. That's not, I feel like that term is overused, but it does require us to do a little, to put forth a little bit more effort than just recreating the same experience that we have inherited.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to that issue, I mean, that's what I think the ritual of the potluck is really important. I know even, my own family, I think even my mother started figuring out that like, if she doesn't have to make everything for it, it's just better. I mean, traditionally it's been the matriarch of the family had that, and so Thanksgiving became a chore, or any other kind of holiday meal became a chore. And so I think there's a kind of ethical way to, I mean, potlucks are more ethical, and they're more fun because people aren't exhausted by doing everything. Of course, there's always going to be one person that wants to do everything and then be the martyr. But at the same time, it's like, that it's not. It seems like one shouldn't take the potluck aspect for granted. That it's a way of doing all these things, but also in a way that makes it more enjoyable for the people participating, and more likely that you're going to get a diversity of things, and just make it so that that some people aren't don't have to do all the work to make it to make it enjoyable. And also I think I don't know a lot about Friendsgivings, but I imagine that they are well, tell me about Friendsgiving celebrations that you all have been to, if you have been to them.
Oh, I think one thing I'm noticing as you're saying that with the potlucks is that like by sort of having to reckon with and retell these greater stories of the whole holiday and the meaning making, like you're also changing, there's a potential to change the story of the family,
Right.
What family is, and the roles and how we view labor, disrupting the physics of like, oh, it's always the mom who's like,
yes,
holding a lot of this behind the scenes and then ends up being sort of resentful in a terrible cumulative way. It's just like we have to then, by retelling the story and being like, wait, what are we doing? We also have an opportunity to be like, let's not do that anymore either. These sort of like layers of stories that are built from each other and rely on like tied to each other. I think that's just, yeah.
And also at a potluck, each person's bringing something from their own stories, and so then you end up having a kind of organic mix of new stories put together in the potluck. And so, yeah.
I think last year was the first year I haven't hosted or co-hosted with my friend Diana a Friendsgiving in like, I don't know, since 2012 probably. Um, and it was weird to not have that, but it was also just, I don't know. I mean, at least at the ones I've had, Cheryl's been to one. I think Stephanie maybe. I don't remember when your first year. Um, but it's often people. I don't know. I mean, a lot of the ones I've had over the years have been people who live far away from family, or I often have a lot of fellow LGBTQ
Right.
people and who are what, far from family, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. Um, and I don't know. I find that really important for my experience of Friendsgiving. I mean, since being in college and not usually being able to go back to Providence or things like that, and just how people. It's also an opportunity to like have those like really familiar traditional foods when you might not be able to otherwise because you can't visit your parents or things like that. So I think that's been a really important part of Friendsgiving is that it's both playing with what a family might look like or what a different kind of family might look like, but also a way to like have that very traditional family food or feeling when you can't always get that. So it's definitely a mix in that way. And yeah, I don't know what this year will be like with COVID still, but um, I miss having that kind of potluck, and I miss just sort of the stories behind the foods that people bring and what does it mean to them and all that. So I don't know. I love Friendsgiving. I love Thanksgiving with family too, but it's a different thing.
Our regular Friday night dinner practice is usually a potluck with friends. And one thing that was so we kind of had a pod of people that we ate with through most of COVID. But at the early part when we weren't going to other people's houses, what we even did is that we just brought stuff. We still potlucked, but we brought food to each other's house. Our group brought food to each other's houses. And you've done that, Max, right? I think something like that.
Yeah.
Uh, and it just, I don't know. There's something really special about that. It's also one of the things that, I mean, it's not a potluck, but another, thinking about sort of the community building ways of food, I love trick or treating. I think that's a really important way in which people feel like get to ritually experience themselves as a neighborhood. And there's not a lot of stuff that's happening, and there are new rituals too. I love like the what was it called, the trunk or treat, which is another have any which is another way of doing things in a less safe environment. Still, you bring a bunch of people together and they decorate up their trunks and have kids trick or treat at the different trunks, and those are just really really nice ways of using food and play. Let's not underestimate the play. Food is always better in costume, isn't it? And whatever costumes is that we wear. And so I think those are things that I often think about too. Is like, I mean, look, I also think about the taste, but it is more, it's a way of binding. It's a way of feeling the effervescence of the community together, or whatever, to go all Durkheimian or whatever. That you got. I mean, there is a palpable experience of, and that's also why. I mean, I talk about midrash as kind of a practice of adaptation, but also when I'm talking about culinary midrash, I'm talking also about the really powerful affect of internalizing the feelings that come from your from what you're reinterpreting, because it's food and it's people and it's smells and it's all of those things that make you feel good. That, you don't just know the story, you enjoy the story. You enjoy the company, you enjoy the food. It becomes a positive religious experience. I think all that stuff is really important to me in doing culinary midrash, if that makes sense. So that's really, to the extent that religions like to cultivate certain kinds of experiences. I won't say that all of my food experiences are ecstatic, but certainly pleasurable, many of them. That's a really important aspect of that is cultivating the kinds of religious experience of solidarity and of the joy in connecting with the thing, with the bounty of nature and all of that. All of those things are really powerful kinds of food ritual things. Yeah.
I'm kind of amazed at thinking about this, how many people won't go to the funeral or won't go to the wedding, but they'll come to the reception. Or I mean, because I think it's easier to engage in time of mourning, actually, sometimes, if you're eating Swedish meatballs or something. But I mean, the idea of eating and talking it brings comfort, not just in the food itself, but it eases the conversations at difficult times.
Yeah.
It's fun. I always thought it was like tacky not to go to both, but whatever. I mean, on the other hand, my first experience of a Jewish funeral, well, I was a kid and kids didn't go to Jewish funerals, but was going to the kind of the Shiva meal afterwards, where it was just food, one platter of cold cuts after another, and it was like, oh, this is how we deal with death, is that we eat. I thought this, and then I was hooked. I mean, this is great.
Well, I realize I'm keeping an eye on time because of course we have class. But any last comments or questions? I feel like I should eat more. Yeah, I'm hungry now.
Yeah, that is the downside of teaching about food and reading. It makes me hungry all the time. But anyway, I'm so glad you invited me to this group. I love your group. I love what you do. I love religion as art. And yes, this is my particular artistic practice. But it's really fun to be able to share things that I love with people that I love and an institution that I love.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time, and hopefully to see you all as always. I know there's some people who wanted to be here but couldn't for schedule reasons, so I'll post the recording as usual. So yeah, thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.